The old Battle for Macragge models have been re-released around Christmas on a made-to-order basis. I grabbed a copy as I never had the opportunity to play the game when it was originally released, and in this video I'll be painting the Imperial terrain from the box. I'll be working from the reference material as a base for the colour scheme, and to start with I am priming these models with Vallejo grey primer. I'll be using an airbrush for this. You don't necessarily need to use an airbrush as a spray can primers will work absolutely fine, it just makes sense to use whatever you have available. I have primed the underside of the model as well. This is to protect the plastic as I intend to use these models quite a lot for games. Starting with the smaller parts, applying Leadbelcher for any metallic silver areas. Once dry, I move on to coating all of those metallic areas with Nuln Oil to shade the recesses. Next I added some gold details for a little variety using Balthasar gold. For a highlight, I am dry brushing on some Gehenna's gold over those gold details. For flatter areas, I just apply this with a regular brush, aiming for the middle and keeping some of the darker paint showing at each end. Now I use a light dry brush of Runefang steel over all of the metallic parts. This weathers the gold slightly and adds a highlight to all the silver areas. To blend all the gold colours together, add some Agrax Earthshade over all of the golden details. For this light hero I'm using Mephiston Red, being careful as possible to avoid the metal frame around it. Highlight on top of this with Evil Sunz Scarlet, keeping an edge for the dark colour to show through. Added some Wild Rider Red to the top section of the light where the sun would be reflecting from. Once I was happy with it, added some Carroburg Crimson into the recesses, aiming only for these areas as to not darken the rest of the paint too much. Next we will paint the yellow on this canister using Averland's Sunset as a base coat. Shade with Casandora yellow to darken the recesses. Layer in Yriel yellow over the top, avoid the recesses and concentrate the colour in the middle of the panels. Correct any mistakes as you go, if in this case I'm just using Leadbelcher to tidy up these areas. Edge highlight flash Gitz yellow just along the prominent edges. Apply some Arctic white to the plasma parts as a base coat. Now we're going to water down some Baharroth blue and allow this to pull in the recesses with the white showing through at its zenith. Now that's dry, we're going to shade with Drakenhof Nightshade, once again just in the deepest parts of the recesses. Now we're going to dry brush Baharroth blue all over the plasma and its surrounding areas to give the effect of light emanating from this plasma. Lightly dry brush Arctic white in the same way, making sure to use a smaller amount as to let the previous steps show through. Layer a thin coat of Arctic white over just the very tops of those ridges, just to really bring out that highlight on the white. Coat the grip of the handle with Mechanicus standard grey. We're going to be shading that down with Nuln Oil over the top. Highlight any metallic edges that we've missed with Runefang steel. For the Crash Lander we will start with a base coat of Mechanicus standard grey for the dark grey panels and any areas that we'll be adding metallics to. Base coat Dawnstone all over the light grey panels. And we're going to shade the whole thing with Nuln Oil, allowing this to pull in the recesses as usual. Dry brush Mechanicus standard grey over the top of the dark grey areas to bring back some of the original colour. Dry brush Dawnstone all over the whole thing, as this is the highlight colour for our dark areas as well as correcting the light grey areas at the same time. Dry brush Administratum grey over the top of the light grey areas as a highlight. The sandy base area we need to base coat Steel Legion Drab to start with. Since the lander would kick up some dust during the crash, I'm going to blend these edges in with some watered down Steel Legion Drab. I wasn't entirely happy with the light grey areas, so I've added a slight gradient by layering on a highlight of watered down Administratum grey. To do this, I've been brushing from the darkest parts to the lightest, as the paintbrush will deposit most of the paint at the end of the brush stroke. Dry brush Ulthuan grey over the top of most edges and any sharper points to really sell this highlight. Shade Agrax Earthshade into the prominent grooves and areas where the lander touches the ground to create a clear divide. Dry brush Tallarn sand liberally all over the ground. It won't matter if you get a little on the lander, but do try to avoid smothering it. Lightly dry brush Carroburg stone over the top of those areas, once again letting the previous step show through. To make it look damaged as though it has exploded outwards, what I'm going to be doing is dry brushing on some Abaddon black to these broken areas to the rear. Next we want to lightly dry brush some Rhinoxide over the top of this. Very lightly dry brush Leadbelcher to just the edges themselves, and then any metallic areas like the metal floor, pipes girders that we previously did dark grey. Finally glaze Agrax Earthshade over the top of this to weather it down and to tone down the shine of those metallics. For glass areas such as the cockpit, add a base coat of Stegadon Scale Green to start with. Layer on a watered down coat of Thunderhawk Blue, avoiding recesses and building this colour up towards the edges or in the middle of the panels. Layer watered down Temple Guard Blue on top of this, remaining closer to either the middle or those broken edges. Highlight with watered down Baharroth Blue, just around those broken edges. Highlight the very edges with Ulthuan Grey along any shattered parts. Glaze Drakenhof Nightshade over the top of all of this to blend it in and to create a gradient. Base the gold aquila with Balthasar's gold. Base Rhinoxide over the ammo belt and use Leadbelcher for the silver clasps and stud details. I also used Leadbelcher as a placeholder for the scanner ore specs, but I do change my mind on this later on in the video. Layer Gehenna's gold over the top of the aquila. Follow this up with an edge highlight of Runefang steel. Glaze Agrax Earthshade to dull it back down and blend it all together. For the cockpit markings, I'm using Tamiya masking tape to ensure I get a straight and even line. Probably best to use some tweezers or something for this, but I ended up using my fingers and a brush to apply it instead. Now we can apply our lines with Averland Sunset without too much concern about accuracy. Layer on some Yriel yellow as a highlight just along those edges. Once the tape is removed, there will be a couple of mistakes in places where I overlap the tape, so it's created these very tiny gaps. So to correct this, we're just going to go over with Administratum grey very carefully. For the Auspex scanner, I base coated with Mechanicus standard grey, filled in the screen with Caliban green, detailed a few buttons with Mephiston Red, did the same again but with Moot green, including some freehand on the screen there, and the last few buttons I've detailed with Baharroth blue. For the pouches, I went back and highlighted over the top with Doombolt brown. Shade both these things down with Nuln Oil. Highlight Dawnstone along the edges of the scanner. I added a triangle using Mephiston Red, highlighting with Evil Sunz Scarlet. Base coat the tail with Macragge blue. Let it dry and follow up with a shade of Nuln Oil. For the rest of the details, I'm planning on weathering them slightly, so we'll just paint freehand Mephiston Red. And then freehand Averland Sunset. Once again, any corrections we'll just make with Administratum Grey. Dry brush Macragge blue over the blue areas to bring back the original colour, and follow this up with a dry brush of Carroburg blue for highlights, and then finish off with a very light dry brush of Fenrisian grey. Dry brush the freehand details with Administratum Grey to give it a weathered and worn look. Dry brush Ulthuan Grey all over the top of this to add the last highlight to the very light grey areas. Next, we dry brush Leadbelcher over any dark grey areas such as the engines for a metallic shine. Dry brush Runefang steel over the top of this to bring out that shine even further. For this internal section of the wing, we start by basing with Urk flesh. Shade this down with Croak green all over. Dry brush Snarsnick green quite heavily over the top of this. Next, layer on some Leadbelcher to the pipes and details. Shade Nuln Oil over the top of these areas, being careful not to touch the green that you've already done. I've used the exact same steps on this canister as I did in the previous one, so follow the previous step. The corrections have been done with Dawnstone, and then we've dry brushed over the top with Administratum Grey, and then finally dry brushed with Ulthuan Grey to bring it all together. Some rivets and areas that I wanted to seem corroded or weathered have been shaded with some watered down Steel Legion Drab to create drips and the illusion of sand being kicked up and caking into recesses. Now we want to seal our hard work by using a matte varnish. This will stop the paint from rubbering off during play. You could use a can or something like Munitorum varnish if you have access to it, but in this case I'm using an airbrush, so I'm going to be using Vallejo matte varnish thinned down with a little bit of flow improver. Finally, we want to bring out a shine for certain areas by applying some Vallejo gloss varnish to the glass and lights, just using a brush. Let that dry, and there we have it, good and ready for use on the tabletop. Big thanks to our channel sponsor The Warp. If you live in the UK and are looking to pick up some discounted Warhammer models and paints, please check out my link in the description. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.